Uh, Poststructuralism is our topic today. It's a little bit of revisiting some of the material we've covered already, insofar as we talked about deconstruction. Not yet, but we did talk about this book, R.V. Young's At War with the Word. And in that I talked about deconstruction. We actually have, in I think 2 classes, an actual unit dedicated to that. I'm going to look at one aspect of it, one text for that by Derrida to illustrate it and how it plays out. So despite the fact that nobody refers to deconstruction today, as far as I know, all of them employ deconstructive techniques, and the assumptions are deconstructive assumptions. And I'm going to get to something about those that I've not yet mentioned today, or thus far, which is the effect of it not only on the language, but on the person that uses the language. And to put it briefly, the author is deconstructed, so that the author's identity becomes highly suspect. But I'll get to that when we get to it. This is chapter 4 in Terry Eagleton's Intro to Lit Theory, and I'm going to just trace his argument and comment on it once again. Poststructuralism is rooted and responding to structuralism. So the writings of Ferdinand de Saussure and his view of meaning in language arising from difference, the difference between the sign and the signifier. So a cat is a cat because it's not a cap, or a bat. There's a distinction in terms of letters there that will allow us to understand that. And then his question is, how far is one to press this process of difference then? Cat, he says, is also what it is because it is not a cad or a mat, and mat is what it is because it's not a map or a hat. And then his question, where is this supposed to stop? Because it seems like an infinite process. But if it is an infinite process, how about the idea of Saussure that languages are closed, fixed, stable systems of meaning? Because Saussure, we mustn't read Saussure as saying what the poststructuralists take him to be saying. He doesn't think that language is this infinite play and it's infinitely changing. He thinks it's a structure, and it's a stable structure at that. Here's how the structure plays out through the interplay between the sign and the signifier and the signified, but ultimately he sees a stable structure there. So he is trying to establish a universal system of understanding how language works. So in that sense, he's a humanist. He thinks that for all the differences between languages, there are certain stable structures that exist there, and here's how they work themselves out. So his assumptions are those of a humanist, and human nature is a fixed, stable thing for him, or at least it's not something that he questions. And I would say that the questioning of human nature does not even arise until the 1960s. And at which point it becomes almost the preeminent subject of study in literary theory. So it's hard when I talk about Romanticism, which I often do, and I talk about its connection with postmodernism, and people can see the postmodernism in Romanticism. It's hard for us not to see the outcome of, or the consequences of, ideas in their germinal phase. And so we could be unfair to the Romantics for claiming they were postmodernists effectively, and only saying that, and can't imagine they could be read in any other way, but it's plain from their contemporaries that they're not read that way. And if you read the authors, they don't intend to say what we take them to be saying either. So I think it's only fair to the authors themselves and as to ourselves as scholars to try and take them as they intended to be taken. And at the same time to recognize that if there is a weak or unformed or deficient idea that's presented, its deficiency works itself out in time so that everybody can see what was problematic about it to begin with. And I think that is evident in Romanticism, and I think it's also now evident in the structuralist view of language. And that's been demonstrated by the post-structuralists. But I don't think it's fair to read the structuralists as if they were post-structuralists or deconstructionists even. Anyway, I just say that as a point of scholarly integrity. I think it's important to assert that. On the other hand, we can't avoid seeing the consequences because of the consequence of a bad idea, if it's held on to as if it were true, is very problematic for us. So that we live in the light of the post-structuralists, and our contemporaries are still post-structuralists in their view of language. So our look earlier in the semester at the linguistic turn with Martin Heidegger and with Ferdinand de Saussure with his general course in linguistics, these are the foundation for later views, and the later views claim to be making comments not only about the 20th century's view of language, but all language and throughout human history. Whereas I would have thought they could have said, if the consequence of Saussure are so debilitating as we see them to be, then maybe his whole theory was wrong and we ought to revisit it. That would seem to me the obvious thing to do. So again, Saussure is coming up by his own admission with a new way of looking at language. Let's try and look at it through this idea of a structure. And if the structure then keeps on morphing into more and more ridiculous ideas, then you would say, well, maybe the theory needs to be discarded. But that's not what happens. So later writers will basically destroy structuralism from within while still holding on to structuralism as if it was the only view of language that was out there. And with it, they will then also deconstruct human nature. So it is literally at war with the word, as the title of that book suggested. And with that, then it is an attack on liberal education from within the academy. And Francis or R.V. Young suggested why that might be, and even suggested some of the alternatives. Now, I didn't get into that last time, but he does in this book very helpfully come, and I hadn't realized this when I set this up last semester, because I hadn't read the book in a few years. He actually goes to Augustine like I did and talks about how Augustine's view of language is very much of an alternative to this. So have a look in the sections in this on what he says in Augustine. He goes to his Confessions and his talk about time in the Confessions and how that that distinguishes itself from this. But anyway, back to this. So Saussure's idea is that language has a closed, stable system. His successors, the post-structuralists, demonstrate that this is not so. So and they say if every sign is what it is because it's not all the other signs, then every sign would seem to be made up of a potentially infinite tissue of differences. It's potentially infinite, never stops. The endless play of signifiers, they will say. And so another way of putting it, meaning is the result of a division or an articulation of sign. Now, articulus in Latin is your pointer, your index finger. Articulus, to articulate is to point something out. So it's an articulated articulation of signs. They point at something, and the thing you point at gives its meaning. Now, note again that this view of language is not what the philosophers will call a view of language where there is a reality that's pointed to. They don't adhere to the correspondence theory of truth. That's what the philosophers will call it, where a word corresponds to a thing. Right? That was Augustine's view that would fit roughly into that understanding. The words don't point to things, the words point to other words, and the words, of course, are in a sense things. But for the structuralists, the words never actually point to the things because the things are only revealed through the words. So it's a word referring to a word, and if we mean a thing by the word, well, that's just another word. So it never gets out of the problem of language. It's always words referring to other words. It never gets to the point of referring to a thing, if you see what I mean. So if language is the house of being, as Heidegger puts it, and if we only understand anything through words and never outside of words, then we never can escape the problem of this endless play of signifiers. And we never actually can talk about anything outside of the language itself. So it is a closed system, but the closed system never gets out of anything other than it's just talking without meaning. Even though it tries to mean, it never actually achieves that meaning. So meaning is as Eagleton puts it, is the spin-off of a potentially endless play of signifiers rather than a concept tied firmly to the tail of a particular signifier. Now, if structuralism divides the sign up from the reference, the thing that the sign is referring to, the poststructuralist goes a step further and it divides the signifier from the signified. So how does this work? Now he's going to illustrate it here, and I think it's quite frankly absurd. I'll say it at the outset, you probably know that anyway. But he gives illustrations of it which I think are quite helpful sometimes in understanding what is being presented. But he says this, so another way of putting it, what we just said, is that the meaning is not immediately present in a sign. The meaning's deferred. Since the meaning of a sign is a matter of what the sign is not, because remember, the definition of black is not white. It's binary, right? There's a system of binaries. Now, and when contemporary gender identity theorists or whatever oppose the binary, what they're in part opposing is the structuralist view of presence and absence, because again, even in that system of binaries, there was also a hierarchy. So being, for instance, and non-being are not equivalent things. This is being, this is nothing, if you will. These are binaries in one sense, but in another sense, being has reality and non-being or nothing is literally nothing. So it's and in binary code, which we use to program computers, and they write in binary code, they are ones and zeros. Literally, the whole code is written in terms of that and that. Are these two numbers? No, nothing. Nothing is not a number. I know that in primary school they think it is. And one of the things that I found troubling when I was a boy, and you probably found it troubling as well, if you divide 10 by 0, you get 0. Like, how is that possible? If you divide 10 by 1, you still get 10. Okay, but so it's 1 less, and now I get 0. That, like, conceptually, did that ever trouble you? Did you find that? Okay. But that's because it's not another number. If I even divided it 10 by the smallest number possible, whatever the point 0.00000 all the time, then I would end up with a huge number. But if I divide it by 0, I get nothing. So that's because it's not a number. And it would be the same whether I divided it or multiplied it furthermore, right? 10 times 0 is just the same as 10 divided by 0, isn't it? No? Or is 10 divided by 0, it's still 10? No? It's the same, right? Yeah. So it's not another number, it's an extraordinary thing. And similarly, infinity. My son has a hard time with this. My daughter says that I love you infinitely. My son says I love you infinity plus 100, or 99 plus 99. I think, well, you don't get what infinity is. You can't add a number. Like infinite means there's no, but he thinks it's just another type of number. And 0 is taken to be that, but strictly speaking, something that has an existence and can be numbered finitely is not the same as something that has no finitude at all. And so 0 here is a very different sort of thing. And so I'm just saying these are not two species of the same thing. There's not an equivalence here. They're, in fact, categorically different. Although we reckon that nothingness by that figure, the 0. Very important as well. And it's a philosophically potent thing as well. What's the difference between being and non-being? There it's numerically represented, but it's not just another number. And then you get into the philosophy of number, what actually is a number. And there are different theories on what it is, by the way. Very interesting, I think. But here, when we get the sense that being and non-being, the one defines the other. But is that actually true? Does non-being or nothing define what something is? I don't think so. In the same way that 0 defines 1. Well, it doesn't. 0 has no definition. Right? So that is not the same then of other sorts of equivalences and even hierarchy. So we could talk about parent-child here. Or man-woman. Or male-female, or whatever. And according to the structuralist understanding, the one is simply the opposite to the other, so it defines the other. A male is not a female. A female is not a male. It's the negation of the other. But furthermore, there's a recognition of a hierarchy, and you can draw a roughly equivalent sort of hierarchy along there, and this feminist scholars will do precisely that, by the way. They'll say that men have presence and existence, and they have a status and so forth, where women are effectively the equivalent of a nothing in this system, because everything's binary, and they assume that the binary relations are equivalent across the board. Whereas I would say that these things are not all like the other. Go back to Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other, right? And yes. Remember that? It's my childhood with Sesame Street. These are not all the same. Like a man and a woman is a very different thing than a parent-child. Very different. These are both adults. These are sexually complementary opposites. A child, on the other hand, is just an immature adult. But even an adult is not the same as a parent, because you can be an adult and not be a parent. So there are different relations going on there. So it's not just an issue of negation, but in the structuralist view of language, they are just defined by their opposites. So maybe you need more opposites here in order to fully define what a parent is then here. So it would be child, also adult. But then in the relation, there would be some sort of relational things there. But that is how the structuralist view of language works, is this correspondence between the two binaries. But this is the thing that they most emphasize within it, and this is where I think it's telling. This is the key one. Of all the ones that have been laid out here, this is the one that is key. Being and nothing. And so the post-structuralists arise out of the nihilism of the French in the 1960s. So the French nihilism of the 50s and 60s and so forth. It comes out of that, and there's also a political context there in France, which is roughly very sympathetic to Marxism. So it's a way of philosophically pursuing a destabilization of the powers and authorities. But Jean-Paul Sartre says that if God exists, then I don't exist. I can't tolerate the idea that God exists, because if he exists, then I am nothing. I am annihilated. I think it's a bad form of thinking, but if you think in the binary terms and I am defined by what I'm not, if God is, then I am not again. If he is ultimate being, then I, in comparison to him, have no being. And if I can't even see it as degree, but of kind, which all these things are, there is no degree here, it's all just kind, right? These are distinctions all on kind. Whereas I would say, as a Christian, that a man and a woman are not differences of kind there per se. I don't even know how to describe it. It's not a difference in quality. It is a difference it's not a difference in kind either. The two together are humankind. Furthermore, the two together are one flesh in marriage. And the two together are called by God are called man, furthermore. Troubling the feminists, just the term even. But there's a unity within that differentiation here, whereas there is no unity in this differentiation. Although there is no unity of the same species as this one. So does the structuralist account of language actually work very effectively in differentiating things for us and distinguishing things and accounting for how language actually operates? I just simply don't think so. But the poststructuralists accept that all of language works in a binary way. And with that, then, they go to this thing, the being and nothingness, as the distinguishing thing, as the key. They don't go talking about man, women, or parent, child. They could have done that. They didn't. Or even human, non-human, or something like that. They talk about it in terms of being or nothingness. So with that said, what does Eagleton say about this? Another way of putting what we've just said is that meaning is not immediately present in a sign, since the meaning of a sign is a matter of what the sign is not. Its meaning, note that it defines it by negation. This is a very funny way of definition. I would have thought when you're using words, you're defining what it is. So a cat isn't a dog. Or a cat, that was a deconstructionist way of it. A cat is a feline. It's a four-legged creature that eats this, does that. You'd have all sorts of things that would characterize the definition. Both four-legged, both mammals, etc. But what are the differences? Well, you would say something that was distinct about it, not that it was not a dog, because it would also be not a horse. That's not helpful. You would say what it is. But here it's what it is not. So since the meaning of a sign is a matter of what the sign is not, its meaning is always, in some sense, absent from it, too. They're going to make heavy weather of this absence. So meaning, if you like, is scattered or dispersed among the whole chain of signifiers. It cannot be easily nailed down. It is never fully present in any one sign alone. Now, if meaning or words are defined by what they're not, this is true. But they're mistaking that words are defined in this way. But anyway, reading a text is more like tracing this process of constant flickering than it is like counting the beads on a necklace. So it flickers between presence and absence. Because whenever I speak of a woman, I have in the back of my mind not a man. And again, for the feminist, something that has being as opposed to something that has no being, no public status or whatever, the public and the private. All of these definitions. At which point it becomes an existential fight. If I don't have equivalence, equality, then I have no status at all. But there's another sense in which we can never quite close our fists over meaning, he says, which arises from the fact that language is a temporal process. When I read a sentence, the meaning of it is always somehow suspended, something deferred or still to come. One signifier relays me to another, and that to another. Earlier meanings are modified by later ones, and although the sentence may come to an end, the process of language itself does not. There is always more meaning where that came from. I do not grasp the sense of the sentence just by mechanically piling one word on the other. For the words to compose some relatively coherent meaning at all, each one of them must, so to speak, contain the trace of the ones which have gone before and hold itself open to the trace of those which are coming after. Each sign in the chain of meaning is somehow scored over, crossed out, or traced through with all the others to form a complex tissue which is never exhaustible. And to this extent, no sign is ever pure or fully meaningful. This to me is absolute gobbledygook and nonsense. But what I've put in my notes here is this is a bizarre form of alphabetical determinism. That the meaning is determined by the letter. So is the bat, the cat, the mat, the whatever. And that determines the meaning. Well, this is ridiculous. No language works that way. At this point, if this is what is meant by Saussure's structuralism, then we just dispense with Saussure's structuralism. But I'm not even sure it's fair to consider Saussure this way. But this is what Jacques Derrida will do with him. And he does it in accordance with, again, these two things, the being and nothingness. And he will use them to talk about all these other things. Now, where does this go? The fact that a sign can be reproduced is part of its identity, but it's also what divides its identity, because it always can be reproduced in a different context, which changes its meaning. So what does he give as an illustration? This is a funny illustration. Cat, a cat. It can be a furry, four-legged creature. It can also be a malicious person. You know, use cat in English. Fight like cats. It's also a knotted whip, a cat o' nine tails. That's a cat. In British English, you can call that a cat. You don't add the nine tails, it's just a cat. It's also an American. Hey, cat. No? It's also a horizontal beam for raising a ship's anchor. That's also called a cat. It's a six-legged tripod, apparently. It's a short tapered stick and so on. All these are uses of the word cat, so the context is going to explain the meaning. But even when it just means a furry four-legged animal, this meaning will never quite stay the same from context to context. The signified will be altered by the various chain of signifiers in which it is entangled. So your cat and my cat, these are all cats, but the context adds a little different meaning to what the cat is, apparently. So there is a furry four-legged animal that lives in my house. He's gray. His name is Gandalf. That's my cat. You may have a different cat, but for me, he has associations with, I guess, the name, and the name with other things. So those are the meaning of the cat Gandalf that resides in my house. That crazy four-legged beast, not mythological, but strange all the same. So for me, cat has different associations, and those come from the different contexts and the different time and the experience and all that. So to some degree, all of those things are part of the meaning of cat for me, he says. And so the implication of this is that language is much less stable than Saussure suggested. It's much less stable. This is Derrida's main point. Nothing is ever fully present in signs. Ever. Some of the meaning is deferred, and it's endlessly so. You never get to that point of closure because we are always speaking within the context of being finite in our being. And language, likewise, being only meaningful from within language itself. So further words are going to amend or change the initial definition, and every time I add a word, it changes the meaning of the thing. So language changes that. And furthermore, and this is the next implication of it, and I said it at the outset, and this is where 1960s lit theory goes with this, nothing being ever fully present in the signs, it's an illusion for me to believe that I can ever be fully present to you in what I say or write. Because to use signs at all entails that my meaning is always somehow dispersed, divided, and never quite at one with itself. And not only my meaning, but me. And so in the 1960s, I think I assigned this, but I'm not 100% sure, because I've taught this course several times over the years, and I sometimes change some of the core texts. But Roland Barthes, now this is not Karl Barth, the philosopher. This is Roland Barthes, the French critic, will write an essay called The Death of the Author. And this is exactly what he is maintaining here, is that we're not even sure of there being an author. We only have access to the author through the text, and the text being composed of words, but the words being endlessly differs, and furthermore meaning something only in relation to their absence. It defers our understanding of who the author is. In fact, the author as such does not even exist for us. So this is another attack on logocentrism. Since language is something I am made out of, rather than merely a convenient tool I use, the whole idea that I am a stable, unified entity must also be a fiction. Not only can I never be fully present to you, but I can never be fully present to myself either. I will need new signs. I'll need to use signs when I look into my mind or reach my soul, and this means I will never experience any full communion with myself. Barthes calls this the death of the author. And remember, in the classical understanding of what you do in your reading is that you are understanding the author's intention. But he says we don't have access. We can never achieve that process because of what language does in undermining that. There's always a loss of not only the original author, but even our own consciousness. Yes?
So that implies then we could never know God through Scripture.
Of course. And in fact, it will become explicit there. They will say, so God, that the G-O-D is a transcendental signified, and they will explicitly say, there is no transcendental signified. But if there's no God, now in the 19th century, the theology is called the death of God. It's categorized by that. Nietzsche himself says it. God is dead. And people were scandalized by it. Although Nietzsche was actually probably not the inventor of that idea so much as the popularizer. You know, God is dead, and we have killed him. And he's very proud of that fact. Here, the consequence of that comes closer to home. The author is dead, and human nature is dead as a consequence. It's a category that we've assumed up to this point has integrity, coherence, meaning, purpose, etc. But this view of language undermines that certainty. And so this becomes a consistent come the 1960s and Roland Barthes. It's not just what Jung says. It's not only at war with the word, it's at war with the person. It's at war with the author. It's also therefore a war with authority, because I think that Eagleton is correct when he says later in this chapter that unlike the Anglo-American school, the French school of Derrida has a political agenda here, in a way that probably the Americans don't. It is more related to Marxism. It is related more to undermining the claims of authority of those who are in authority. And it does so by attacking all authority as a fiction, a very useful fiction for those in power. So Michel Foucault, who will also come in the wake of the post-structuralist, will talk about language as power and say that language is in fact used to further the purposes of the powerful, and will even define things in order to punish people. And of course, with Foucault, he himself was a homosexual, so he will come up with an idea that, again, the homosexual is a form of suppression of the heterosexual of the homosexual. And again, that's binary. The homosexual has existence, is acknowledged in law, has status, whereas the homosexual does not exist at all. It's annihilated. It's nothing. It's being destroyed. This sort of and it's a power play at that point. Well, it would be a power play if words can never mean anything, right? That's another consequence. If it is true what the deconstructionists say about language, and that we can't even know the author or ourselves, then what do words do other than try and further an agenda not of establishing meaning but of establishing power? And then you get back into the position of Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, who says that justice is the powerful getting their advantage. Go back and read the Republic. It's all in Plato. It is. And in our day, the cultural Marxists, exactly what they'll say. Power, privilege, access, whatever, right? The intersectionality. What's my identity? Well, it's related to this nexus of factors that give me being or non-being. Either I have them, in which case I have power, privilege, access, whatever, or I don't have them, in which I'm effectively nothing. And so the purpose of language then is to overturn the status quo and to give power and privilege and access and resources and standing and status, etc., to those who currently don't have it through the use of language, which is unjust. Why is it unjust? Well, it's not actually unjust. It's just that it's oppressing those who don't have the power and exalting those who do have the power, but they can't appeal to the concept of justice because it doesn't exist. Justice is just a word for them. They announce it quite explicitly. So once again, if you are of the mindset that post-structuralism is correct, then you are announcing quite openly and publicly that your use of language is really not about understanding or dialogue or anything like that, although they use the terms. It's simply a power play. That's what they say of their opponents, but that's what they believe about themselves. So language is a form of warfare against the establishment. And now it happens from within the establishment. So the claim is that this polarity of being meaningful or absent of meaning demonstrates the absence as much as the meaning, and meaning is never fully established. It ends up in a sort of nihilism and a despair. And a despair about the possibility of truth and goodness and beauty and justice gives rise to an anger and a hostility, which then marks the academy, and not the passing on of knowledge, but rather the transformation of the academy into a form of activism, social activism. But I can still persuade myself that things are meaningful. How does that happen? Well, here's what Eagleton says. One way I might try to persuade myself that that having meaningful experiences or meaningful life, one way I can persuade myself, and he could say delude myself, is by listening to my own voice when I speak. So it's not that I don't exist. If I listen to my voice, I know that I do exist. After all, that's what Descartes did, right? I think, therefore I am. So I have established the certitude about my thinking there, right? So I listen to my own voice. Rather than writing my thoughts down on paper. Now, they're going to make a big, heavy weather about this. Jacques Derrida will make a big deal about the difference between speaking and writing here. And the privileging of speaking, because he says that people try to establish certainty about themselves by speaking, whereas they ought to observe the importance of writing. And he's going to go to Plato, and that's when we do the deconstruction segment, I'm going to look at his little work on Plato's Pharmakon. It's about writing and about language. But he says, in the act of speaking, I seem to coincide with myself in a way quite different from what happens when I write. Because as I say, I can think that I'm thinking. I'm certain about my being. I'm not caught up in this absolute nihilistic despair that I might not even exist. I can hear my own voice. However, when I write, there's a distance there. And my spoken words seem immediately present to my consciousness, and my voice becomes their intimate, spontaneous meaning, whereas in writing, my meanings threaten to escape from my control. Somebody can misinterpret my words. I write a text. I know what I mean when I write the text. The person on the other end of the text misconstrues my meaning. I realize that a written word can lose the context in which I'm writing it. Like I'm writing the text here, somebody is on the other side of Toronto. They don't understand that I'm responding to something immediately around me because I haven't said that, I've just used the words, and they misinterpret what I've meant, or I'm not a very clear writer, or whatever. So writing loses that sense of certitude. And Derrida observes that writing seems to rob me of my being. The very certitude I had when I spoke is lost when I go to write. It's a second-hand mode of communication, writing, a pallid, mechanical transcript of speech. And so always at one remove from my consciousness. And it's for this reason that the Western philosophical tradition, all the way from Plato to Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist I talked about a few classes ago, has consistently vilified writing as a mere lifeless, alienated form of expression, and consistently celebrated the living voice. So says Eagleton, and so says Derrida. Who would we say is exempt from this? I would say Christians. They're the people of the book. It is the word of God, but it's the written word as well. It's written down. These are the very words of God. There is an exaltation of writing, not just speaking, but writing. In Plato, we can note, and we will note when we look at Derrida, his correct observation that Plato was very concerned about writing things down and the loss of meaning that comes with it. And he distrusted writing. And he gives an illustration of why that is. Gives a little, one of his little stories about writing and the danger. Writing, people write things down in order to remember them, right? So to preserve them. He notices the more you write things down, the less you remember them, because you don't commit it to memory. You just commit it to the page, and then you can forget it. You write in your notes, and then you stick it somewhere and say, I've remembered it. Well, it's just like the internet. It's all written text somewhere. I'm going to do some research. Well, you don't know anything. You're just going to look it up, right? So it's replaced knowledge and the memory, the text that you would have memorized at one point is gone. People can't even cite scripture anymore. And he further says, then writing, as I say, robs me of my being. And behind this prejudice, and he says it's throughout the whole Western tradition, and I think there is something to his case. It's just when it comes to Christianity, it's totally false. It's the exact, I don't even want to say it's the opposite. Christians say that the Bible is the Word of God. and you must not alter it. You must not add to it. You must not take away from it. Look at the book of Revelation. So Derrida's comments about the Western tradition ignore the Western tradition. They act as if there was the ancient world of Plato, and then we come all the way over to René Descartes. And then there's this sort of thing that happened in between that which I thought was transformative and important. It was called Christendom. But Derrida treats it as species of the same thing, and it's just because I think he's fundamentally not a serious scholar in this sense. And those that are, again, in the academy who are not very attentive to the distinctives of Christian life and Christendom are happy to undermine the authority of the authorities, particularly if they're connected with the church and with Christian doctrine. And Christian doctrine, one of the foremost points being the theology of the human person. It's a legacy of that. Like, where do we get the idea that human beings have a sanctity, the sanctity of life? Where does this idea come from? It's not from the classical world. The Romans didn't think it. The Greeks didn't think it. The Romans and Greeks enslaved people. They massacred their enemies. They committed eugenic experiments. Or maybe not eugenic experiment. Well, they did sort of. The Spartans did. That set the weak out to die. So the strong, the gene pool would be strengthened by the hardy sorts. This is a sort of eugenics program. The idea that human beings have a sanctity of life comes from Christian doctrine, that we bear the imago Dei, and that God alone not only defines life, but has the prerogative to take it away, and no one else but him, other than in accordance with his law. So it says, you shall not murder. But if you do murder, there's a consequence. If it's first-degree murder, it's a capital offense. Right? So there it is justified, but then again, it's justified in accordance with the written word. But in the Roman tradition, life is very cheap. And the extra Christian traditions of the world, there is no sanctity to life. And the Chinese are correct when they have said that your idea of the sanctity of life is a Western construct. They're incorrect insofar as they say it's a Western construct. It's not Western, it's Christian. Because Western included people who agreed with the Chinese that there are no human rights. It's Christians that upheld the humanity of the slave and the orphan and the child and the woman. By the way, under Roman law, a woman has no rights. Her husband can take her life. She's not even allowed to inherit property. So, when he says that the Western tradition, here, this summary statement that the Western philosophical tradition, all the way from Plato up to lévi-strauss, has consistently celebrated the living voice of, and not the written word, he deliberately, I would say, misrepresents the influence of Christianity. Or he's ignorant, and I don't think he's ignorant. He's too smart, too well read here. But behind this prejudice, he says, lies a particular view of man. Man is able spontaneously to create and express his own meanings, to be in full possession of himself, and to dominate language as a transparent medium of his inmost being. Where do we get this idea from? That our expression is our identity. Who says that? Self-expression is the locus of our human nature. The Romantics. This arises from the Romantics. This is not a classical doctrine. They would think this was absurd. And that was the very view of human nature that he ridiculed at the outset, did Eagleton. I can't believe that he's not being disingenuous here. But this view of man, what the view of man, in other words, the romantic man, the man who exists when he expresses himself, he's creative. His words define who he is. What this theory fails to see is that the living voice is in fact quite as material as print. And that since spoken signs, like written ones, work only by a process of difference and division, speaking could be just as much said to be a form of writing as writing is said to be a second-hand form of speaking. That's Eagleton's critique of the Deconstructionists. There. So he's not going to have the Deconstructionists, because really all Eagleton's agenda is here as a Marxist is to he's unhappy with the fact that the Deconstructionists aren't on board with the political project of Marxism. They're just a little too nihilistic here for him. And self-defeating. You can even apply it to your phonocentrism, as he called it. But just as Western philosophy, now he is towing the Derrida line, just as Western philosophy has been phonocentric. Now phono here in Greek means voice. A phonograph is a voice. Phonetics is the sound of the words, phonics. Just as the Western philosophy has been phonocentric. When he says Western philosophy, he means Plato. Not true of Aristotle, actually, but it is there in Plato. And it's true of a few others, perhaps. I hate these grand sweeping statements. But just as Western philosophy has been phonocentric, centered on the, quote, living voice, unquote, and deeply suspicious of script, so also it has been in a broader sense logocentric, committed to a belief in some ultimate word, presence, essence, truth, or reality which will act as the foundation of all our thought, language, and experience. It's always been committed to some sort of transcendentals. Being as opposed to non-being. Truth as opposed to falsehood. Or presence. Or essence. These are categories. And as he notes rightly, these aren't just binary opposites. There's a status to one and a non-status to the other. But as it has been connected with all of these things, it is yearned for the sign which will give meaning to all the others. And what is that? The transcendental signifier, namely God. That will hold together all of these, what Plato calls the forms. It needs the one thing that will unite all of these signifiers. The anchoring, unquestionable meaning to which all our signs can be seen to point. And a great number of candidates for this role. God, the idea, the world, spirit, the self, substance, matter, and so on have thrust themselves forward from time to time. I think it's probably accurate. And these are not equivalents, by the way. So in the Romantics, it's probably the self. Christian thinking, it's God. In Platonic thinking, it's the idea. In Hegel, it's the world spirit. You could argue in Aquinas, it's being. Amongst materialists, it'll be matter. But it's this concept that anchors all the other ones. These have come forward from time, and since each of these concepts hopes to found our whole system of thought and language, it must itself be beyond that system. Right? Because it'll be it's the undefined definer. So it can't be contained within the whole system of thought. It's outside the system of language. It's untainted by its play of linguistic differences, because remember, the play of differences contains that of being and non-being. And so something that grounds all being can't have non-being as part of its definition. So therefore, God can't exist. It must have existed before they did, but it can't, because as soon as we refer to God, we also think not God. And that in conclusion here, he says, that any such transcendental meaning is a fiction, though perhaps a necessary fiction, is one consequence of the theory of language I have outlined. What other things are involved in this, implicated in the challenge and the problem here of the idea that God is a necessary assumption for all the other ones to hold, and yet it is only that. Well, what else is in the same sort of thing? Freedom, the family, democracy, independence, authority, order, and so on. All of these things originate in God. Without God, no freedom. Without God, no family. Without God, no idea that there is rights and power to the people, democracy. No sense of independence, etc. These are all, they all originate in God. These are inalienable rights. We hold these things to be true. Now, this is Derrida, and he says that any system that depends on a foundation, a metaphysics, a first principle, is metaphysical, and metaphysics, he says, is already using language and thereby inferring the negation of metaphysics. So then metaphysics is also impossible. There is no transcendental signified. So the idea that God exists is defeated by the view of language which he presents. And language again works through this play of signifier, signified in this case, being and non-being, or being and nothingness. So when I talk about the ultimate being of God, it falls into the problem of the binary. Again, for me, this is not troubling or problematic for getting around the whole dilemma that he creates, which is just, this is a false view of language. Nobody operates this way. Nobody thinks this way. You have to be thoroughly disturbed and to persist with this view of language. It's not even the way your own language works. And it denies the very thing that Christians have upheld about the Bible, namely that it is the Word of God. And that it's revelation further. Now that's also important. This is not just humans saying things about God. This is God telling us who he is. He's revealing himself through people in words. But it is revelation. It's not description. Right? It's self-declaration. This is why we read the Bible in a Christian service of worship. Because there's no replacement for it. You can't substitute human words for God's revelation of himself. He declares who he is. In the very thing that you're reading about God, he's revealing himself to you through that. But again, Derrida doesn't consider that, and neither does Mr. Eagleton when he's summarizing here. So these are false inferences from faulty premises, speculative premises, it seems to me. When we come to feminism, which will come in a few classes, they will make much out of this, though, this dichotomy that Derrida constructs. They will say that woman is the opposite of man. So if here I am myself, and this will become, so I talked about being and nothingness. And if you look at these master concepts, so we could talk about the self up here. What would be its opposite? It would be the other. Then we would have the native and the alien. The male and the female. You can see these dichotomies being set up, and the equivalence is drawn between them all as well. Again, myself, I have being. A man has being, has status, and so forth, but the woman, who's the opposite, must not only be opposite the male but other than the male. Again, it does not attend then to the distinctions which Scripture actually says about the nature of woman. She's not just other. If she's other, so is an animal, and so is a plant. So is a tree, or so is whatever. So is the water, so is the air. In that sense, all these things are other than man. But that's not what's meant by woman. It's not the other. But in feminist theory, that is exactly what they will say. She is the other man. She is non-man, the negation of man. So she doesn't have a sense of selfhood. She has no security of person. She has no being. It's given to her by men. She has to take it for herself. Will to power. She's going to be the Übermensch. She's the negation of, she's a defective man. And modern feminism, I think, in fact, this is my critique of modern feminism, is that it hates women. It presents women in an androgynous fashion. It's a defective male. So it defines it. So this is perverse and bizarre. Women defining themselves by their deficiencies as men. Like, you would have thought of feminism would assert itself in the goodness of the female as distinct from the male, but that's not how it's defined. It's what it can't do as a male, and it wants to demonstrate its validity as women by doing everything that a man can do. But then if a man is the opposite of a woman, you're negating the very thing which is supposed to be distinct. It leads to androgynous thinking, and furthermore, it leads to cyborg thinking, by the way, because the natural and artificial is likewise a specious category, but we'll come to that later on the course. But even when we come to men, a man is what he is only by virtue of ceaselessly shutting out this other as his opposite. So I only becoming a man by beating down women. Like the caveman, right? You got to drag her around by the hair and show her who's boss. Right? All those texts that you read about from the ancient cavemen that describe what the early cave dwellers were like and their relations. Right? Because they always got dragged around by the hair with the bone that was in their hair to keep it up in place, but you had to drag them around by the hair. You know who's really funny on this is G.K. Chesterton. Really, really funny. What's that text that he wrote? I've recommended it to a few of you. It's just... it'll come to me. But he talks about how anthropologists describe the early societies, and the men are invariably beating down women. And he says they don't have any text, so where are they getting their evidence for this? Like, there's no text that demonstrates this at all. None. And even what does remain of early cave dwellers, and maybe they're not even dwelling in the caves, maybe they just use caves for their artistry. Because they're the things that remain, right? If they had any houses, then they're going to be gone by now anyway. I mean, our houses are gone within 100 years. Why would their houses last for centuries, nay, millennia? Why would they do so? The caves remain, and there are paintings on the side. Well, maybe this is a nursery. That's why the paintings look so primitive. Because the kids like it. It's bright colors. But there's no writing, so we have no idea what they thought. But the anthropologists posit this idea that early human origins were barbaric and vulgar, and men were bashing down women, dragging them around by their hair, and then gradually we became more and more civilized and more equal. It demonstrates that they are wonderful, and the male-female difference is a bad thing. But so the man is what he is only by virtue of ceaselessly shutting out this other or opposite, defining himself in antithesis to it. And by his whole identity, I'm reading Eagleton here, page 115, is therefore caught up and put at risk in the very gesture by which he seeks to assert his unique autonomous existence. Woman is not just the other in the sense of something beyond his ken, but an other intimately related to him as the image of what he's not, and therefore is an essential reminder of what he is. Man therefore needs this other even as he spurns it, is constrained to give a positive identity to what he regards as no thing, nothing. Not only is his own being parasitically dependent upon the woman and upon the act of excluding and subordinating her, but one reason why such exclusion is necessary is because she may not be quite so other after all. Anyway, get in line, right? Get in your... But even there's a sense, but what if my relation to the woman also defines me? In the act of crushing the woman, I'm also undermining myself. Again, the whole thing is weird, perverse, twisted, and very familiar, because it's the discourse of our contemporaries. So the summary here, which is the bottom of 115. Structuralism was generally satisfied if it could carve up a text into binary oppositions. High, low, light, dark, nature, culture, so on, and then expose the logic of their working. So that's what structuralism did, just the binaries. And then how do they relate to another? What's the logic between these two binaries? Deconstruction tries to show how such oppositions, in order to hold themselves in place, are sometimes betrayed into inverting or collapsing themselves. And I said the master category is this one, upon which all the others depend. This one. Just sort of smuggled in there as if it were one all like the others, but it's not. This is the master one. It's betrayed into inverting or collapsing themselves, or need to be banished to the text margin, certain niggling details which can be made to return and plague them. Derrida's own typical habit of reading is to seize on some apparently peripheral fragment in the work, a footnote or a recurrent minor term or usage, a casual allusion, and work it tenaciously through to the point where it threatens to dismantle the oppositions which govern the text as a whole. The tactic of deconstructive criticism, that is to say, is to show how texts come to embarrass their own ruling systems of logic. They get unstuck, they contradict themselves, and they thereby deconstruct the author that comes with that, who intends to mean something and finds himself embarrassed. So this will move into Derrida, into Michel Foucault. It will work into the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, and it will work into the French feminist philosopher Julia Kristeva. All similarly, there are differences between them and the distinctions, but it's in Foucault for sure. Now I'm going to come to Foucault when we look at that little text I've given you, Plastic People. And within that, the agenda of gender identity is there. Even if not the intent, the seeds of it are sown in there. The will to power to express something that does not exist as if it existed. And to do so, it has to deny what does exist. Well, what then does exist? I would say that sex and gender are opposites. This is not just a binary, there's a hierarchy. This one has power, this one does not. In order to overturn the powerlessness of these ones, we have to usurp this. So everyone's sex has to give way to gender. Just as for feminists to get their way, all men must be put down from positions of power, authority, privilege, etc. Just as myself has to give away to the other, just as other people outside Canada have to have privilege over those who are born in this country. So we have to welcome worldwide immigration and so forth. It's part of an ideological agenda. Just as we have to give rights to the criminal and deny them to the victim. Or the person in authority. Comments or questions here? I've got 5 minutes left. Do you have any thoughts on this? we've come a long way from where we began last semester when we're talking about literary theory and the subject matter and what it was related to. Certainly it's exposition in Horace when he talks about ars poetica, talks about different genres and the effect of them and certain classical texts and the role of classical texts in pedagogy and in inculcating beautiful writing and exalting human nature. And then we move on to Augustine and his discussion of all that, and then into the Renaissance where he's repeating and this idea of teaching and delighting. This is now a project of no delight, I would say, except through destruction. And the teaching is, so this is another one. What's the difference between this another antinomy here, if you will? Poetry and criticism. They are related to one another, but the poet is not the critic. The critic and the poet are very different things. But come deconstruction, the critics are as poetic and self-expressive as the poets were. And so in English literature, you can, in first year English, go and study English, and what you will read is the critics, not the poets. Right? Because that's the way of subverting the authority of poetry. After all, what is literature? If Shakespeare can cease to become literature, then why wouldn't the critics' crappy writing be exalted as the thing we ought to read? Because critics can't write. It's illegible, or ought to be illegible, but it's certainly gibberish. But you will read what the critics say rather than what Shakespeare says. Because that's one of the other points. Critics become not just parasites on the poets, they replace the poets as the text in order to produce the transformation, the subversion of the establishment, which is the project of the 1960s and continues to this day. Comments or questions, or please make a comment. You're thoughtful. Yes?
I found in the previous class the theories that we were reading were really coherent and they made a lot of sense. And I find that the ones we're reading now seem needlessly complicated. Do you think that's intentional to confuse the reader, or I don't know? I just think it's all very abstract and kind of ridiculous.
Well, you can see what I'm saying about it being dependent on the premises of the previous. That's why I set it up. But when you come to it, it seems frivolous, unnecessary, and maybe unserious.
Yeah.
And yet it's held very strongly and adamantly, this is the thing. This is what we are about, the establishment. So I'm in agreement with you. On the other hand, I'm simply, on this course it's not like the other ones I teach. In the other ones I teach what I think is good and what's best. Here I'm trying to do you a service by saying here's what's out there and here's what's influential. And so when I come to as we get towards the end of the semester, it gets more and more estranged from being meaningful and good. But it's pervasive and it's extraordinarily influential, and this is the world in which you're living, you have to operate. If I just began there with the latest theories, which are getting Canada research chairs now, by the way, so ecofeminism and posthumanism and so forth, these are getting research chairs in universities, which means that somebody's making a living from this, and people will be studying with those professors, getting their doctorates in it, and they will then be stuck in a position for 40 years teaching others of the same thing, and they've never even read Shakespeare. So it's a bad thing, to put it mildly, but it is there, and you will encounter it. So that's the function here. But as I say, it's a very different animal than any other course that I teach. But I agree with you. It's unnecessary. It's fallacious. It's analysis of everything that went before is simply false, and I can't present it better than that. It's just wrong. It's not accurate. It's not scholarly. The idea that the voice had been privileged over the word, the written word, is there in Plato. He talks about it, but he's talking about it pragmatically. You're not worried about language. He wrote texts, right? If he were that worried about it. But he does in one of his letters and in one of his dialogues, he talks about the problem that writing poses for memory. So he's concerned about it. It's an interest. But he isn't saying that the voice has a privilege over writing. This is ridiculous. That's not the sum and substance of Plato, but you would think reading Derrida that it was. But again, look at what Eagleton said himself. Derrida chooses marginal, peripheral footnotes, and then he makes them the substance of the text.
Yeah, because I just wonder, like, why do people believe this? But the way that they seem to write seems to be very persuasive, but they're purposefully omitting a lot of stuff.
It's sort of persuasive, and yet it isn't, because nobody outside the academy is persuaded. In fact, it seems to me a law of diminishing returns. The degrees cost more, but people value them less over time. So they are in the positions of the academy in the sense that now, again, because they have the levers of power, to use their own analogies about power and institutions, they have power. And they are able to wield it, but the question is everybody else going to follow them in this as they once did? Because the humanities used to have some pull, because you would come out of it a better, more well-rounded person. Is that what we're getting in the academy now? I don't think so. And what can they do outside of their area? Absolutely nothing. So it's a law of diminishing returns. They have power, but the power was based on nothingness, and it's collapsing into nothingness, which is why they're angry. They know their time is short. No, really. It's a wholly negative project. It's parasitic on the humanities. And in the end, I can't believe that people still send their kids to universities in masses. I can't believe it. I would discourage it myself, although I think there is something to be said for humanities education. I try and give you one. I think that's genuinely good, but that's not what you're getting in most universities. And the cost, then you have this millstone of debt around your neck, and you're ill-equipped to do anything to get rid of it because you can't think. It's not a good place to be. Anyway, but I could not agree with you more. It becomes more and more absurd. And more peripheral, even that is tracing the trajectory away from the imago, which I talked about, the human, towards things that are not human now. And what really matters now, well, it's the environment. Okay, but the environment includes human nature. Actually, you wouldn't have thought so, because they say man, the environment, as a dichotomy here, and one has being and the other is non-being. We've been oppressing the environment, etc. What a terrible depiction of what has happened historically, people in their environment. Have you never heard of animal husbandry? Well, people can use that. You can't use that term anymore, but right, you're looking after creatures, right? And hunting is there for the purposes of not only feeding yourself, but of culling the herd. It's like an agriculture. Like, there is a good use of human culture. There's also bad uses. But in the environmentalist understanding, any culture is opposed to nature, because, again, they see them as polar opposites, and one is the negation of the other. Either we're going to have nature or we're going to have culture. Well, then, culture's got to go. Got to go. Anyway, I think that's it. Well beyond